Her father's hand came down on the table so hard the oil lamp jumped. "You'll marry him," Edgar Bennett said, "or we lose everything by Friday." Rosalie stood in the doorway of the kitchen, still holding the pot she'd been washing, water dripping off her wrists onto the floor. She had heard the riders come in an hour ago. She had heard the voices in the front room, low and deliberate. The kind of voices men use when they've already decided something and are only waiting to tell the person it concerns. She had kept washing the pot. She had told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. Colton Hayes, her mother said from the corner, not looking up from her mending. Just the name, flat like a stone dropped in still water. He'll take the debt, all of it, in exchange. Rosalie set the pot down on the counter. Carefully. The way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to see. In exchange for what, she said, though she already knew. Her father didn't answer. He just looked at her, that particular look she had known her whole life. The one that measured and found wanting, that tallied her up the way you tally livestock. She understood that the question had already been answered before she walked into the room. If you have ever been the person in the room that everyone else decided about without asking, then you already know exactly what Rosalie Bennett felt standing in that kitchen. And if you haven't watched closely, because the story of what happened next will either break your heart or make you furious. Possibly both. Don't go anywhere. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single chapter of their story. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because it's only just beginning. The Bennett Ranch had been failing for 3 years. Not dramatically, not the way ranches fail in stories, with a single catastrophic flood or a fire that takes the barn and everything in it. The Bennett Ranch failed the way most things fail in real life. Slowly, quietly, one bad season stacked on top of another, one borrowed dollar multiplying into 10, the gap between what they needed and what they had growing wider every month until it stopped being a gap and became a chasm. Edgar Bennett was not a bad man. That was the complicated part. He worked hard, he didn't drink away his earnings, he went to bed exhausted and woke up early and kept at it year after year with the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that effort alone was supposed to be enough. It wasn't. The cattle market turned. 2 calves died in a late frost. The Eastern Bank called in a loans. It had been rolling over for 18 months, and suddenly the number on the paper in the banker's office was not a number a man like Edgar Bennett could argue with. Rosalie knew all of this. She kept the household accounts. She'd been keeping them since she was 14, when her mother's eyesight started going, and her father proved himself to be a man who could build a fence straight, but could not balance a ledger to save his life. She was the one who saw the column of debts lengthen. She was the one who knew, before Edgar did, that they were in serious trouble. She had never told him she knew. That was the thing about being Rosalie Bennett. In the Bennett household, you saw everything. You managed everything. You made the flour stretch and found a way to fix the pump when it started leaking and negotiated with the dry goods man for an extra week of credit, and none of it counted. None of it was visible. What was visible was that she was 22 years old and unmarried, that she was broad-shouldered and full-figured in a territory where men seemed to prefer women who looked like they might snap in a strong wind, and that every eligible bachelor within 30 miles had looked at her and looked away. Her younger sister Clara had married at 19. Pretty, small-boned Clara, who couldn't boil without scorching it, but who could smile at a man and make him feel like he'd accomplished something just by standing in the same room as her. The wedding had been lovely. Rosalie had made the cake. She was not bitter about Clara. That was important to understand. She loved her sister. She simply understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that had been her armor, for as long as she could remember, that she and Clara occupied different positions in the world, and that this was not a situation she had chosen, or could change by wanting it otherwise. What she had not understood, what she had failed, for all her clear-eyed practicality, to account for was that her father would one day use that position as a bargaining chip. Colton Hayes. She had seen him exactly twice in her life. Once at the stockyard auction, 2 summers back, standing on the fence rail with his arms crossed while the auctioneer ran through the lots, not bidding on anything, just watching the prices climb with an expression that suggested the whole proceeding bored him mildly. He was tall, dark-haired, The kind of face that had been weathered enough by sun and wind to look like it had been carved rather than born. The men around him kept glancing at him the way smaller animals watched the largest predator in a field not threatened, exactly, but careful. The second time was outside the Mercantile on Main Street in Harlow. She had been loading flour sacks into the wagon, and he had walked past without looking at her, which was unremarkable. Most men walked past without looking at her. That was the sum total of her knowledge of Colton Hayes, aside from what everyone in Harlow County knew, that he owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, that he had built it himself after arriving in Montana 10 years ago, with nothing but a horse and a reputation that nobody could quite trace the origin of, and that he was 34 years old and unmarried, which local women of marriageable age and their mothers treated as a personal project requiring immediate resolution. He had shown no interest in any of them. He had, apparently, shown interest in the resolution of Edgar Bennett's debt. Rosalie sat at the kitchen table after her father went to bed, and her mother followed him without speaking to her, and she looked at the ledger. She kept in the kitchen drawer the real one, the one with all the numbers, not the partial one she showed her father when he asked. And she sat with the facts of the situation, the way you sit with a sickness you've just been told has a name. The debt was real. The deadline was real. The ranch, if it was lost, could not be recovered. Her parents were too old to start over. Her father's pride would not survive it, and she knew it. She sat there for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. She had one conversation with Colton Hayes before the wedding. It happened 3 days after her father's announcement. In the front room of the Bennett house, which her mother had hastily tidied in a way that struck Rosalie as grimly amusing as though doilies on a side table would make the transaction more dignified. Her father sat in his chair by the window. Her mother sat near the door, very straight. Colton Hayes sat on the settee across from Rosalie and looked at her directly, which was not what she had expected. She had expected him to look away. Men usually looked away. He didn't. "I expect you have questions," he said. Not warmly, not coldly. The same flat, assessing tone she imagined he used at the auction house. "Several," Rosalie said. Her father shifted in his chair. The movement was the kind that meant "don't cause trouble," a language she had been reading her whole life. She ignored it. "Why me?" she said. Colton Hayes was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know what to say, but the quiet of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "I need someone capable," he said finally. "The ranch is large. I've been running the house with a rotating series of women who either can't manage the work or leave after a season because the isolation bothers them. I need someone who'll stay and who can handle it." "And you determined I was capable how, exactly?" I asked around. "About me specifically. About you specifically." That surprised her. She had not expected to be surprised, but she was. She had assumed this was about convenience, that she was the available option, the debt a mechanism. The idea that he had sought information about her before arriving at this arrangement sat in her chest in a way she could not immediately categorize. "And my size," she said, because she had spent 22 years learning that if you didn't name the thing people were thinking about, it festered. "You asked around about that too, I assume." Something shifted in his face. Not embarrassment. She didn't think Colton Hayes embarrassed easily, but something. Recognition, maybe. "It wasn't part of my consideration," he said. "That's a diplomatic answer. It's the true one." She looked at him for a long moment. Her father made another movement in his chair, more urgent this time, practically shouting at her in the language of parental anxiety, and she continued to ignore it. "I don't want to be managed," she said. "If I come to your ranch, I'm not going to be housed somewhere and told to stay quiet and not embarrass you. I'll run the household or I won't be there." "I said I needed someone capable," Colton said. "Capable person runs things. And if the arrangement doesn't work," he looked at her steadily, "what does doesn't work mean to you? If I'm miserable, if your men treat me as a joke, if I find myself in a situation I can't bear." Her mother made a small stifled sound. Her father had gone very still. Colton Hayes looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "I'll expect the same question in return. If the arrangement doesn't suit either of us, we can discuss it." It was not a promise. It was barely an acknowledgement. But it was more than her father had offered her. And something about the directness of it, no softening, no false warmth, just the plain shape of the thing was easier to look at than kindness would have been. She nodded once. "All right," she said. The wedding was small. Rosalie wore her best dress, which was not very grand, and did not pretend to feel things she didn't feel, which her mother found troubling and her father found an embarrassment. Clara had written a letter from her husband's property 2 counties over, warm and sorry, and not quite understanding the situation. And Rosalie had folded the letter carefully and put it in her trunk. 3 women from town came because they had been invited out of social obligation, and Rosalie watched them watching her throughout the short ceremony with the particular avidity of people witnessing something intended to discuss thoroughly later. She recognized all 3, Margaret Ellison's, who had once told Clara, in Rosalie's hearing, that her sister had such a pretty face, if only she would, and then stopped, as though stopping counted as kindness. Louise Tanner, whose daughter had reportedly set her cap for Colton Hayes 2 years running. A woman whose name Rosalie didn't know but whose expression of fascinated pity was so complete it was almost impressive. She looked at them once, calmly, and they looked away. That was something, at least. Colton stood beside her at the ceremony, with the air of a man completing a practical task, which was honestly how Rosalie felt about it as well. And when the words were said and signed, she became Rosalie Hayes, wife of the largest cattle rancher in Harlow County, by virtue of a debt she hadn't incurred and a bargain she hadn't struck. She had packed 1 trunk. She had not cried. She had gone back to the kitchen the night before the wedding and cleaned it from floor to ceiling because she needed to do something with her hands and because she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that her life in that house was over. She didn't know if what came next was better or worse. She only knew it was different. The ride out to Hayes Ranch took 2 hours in the wagon, and Colton drove it himself, which she had not expected. She had imagined a hired man. Instead, it was the 2 of them side by side, on the wagon seat, the October wind coming off the mountains with the first real teeth of the season in it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The land was enormous. That was what struck her first, not the beauty of it, though the mountains were extraordinary, but the sheer scale of the emptiness. You could ride in any direction and find more of it. She had grown up in this territory, and she still felt, every so often, that the landscape was reminding her of something about human scale that she'd rather not think about too closely. "Cold," Colton said eventually. "Yes," she said. More silence. "The cook's name is Alma," he said. "She's been with the ranch 8 years. She's particular about her kitchen. I won't interfere with her kitchen. I didn't think you would. I'm saying she may be particular with you at first." Rosalie considered this. Is she the kind of particular that works itself out, or the kind that doesn't? Which, she was beginning to notice, he actually did thought before answering, rather than producing the nearest comfortable response. "Works itself out," he said. "If you don't push and don't back down, that's a narrow path. She's worth it. Best cook I've ever had." They went another mile without speaking. "The men," Rosalie said. "Not a question, exactly. Some of them will be difficult," Colton said. "I won't pretend otherwise." She hadn't expected that either. She had been bracing for reassurance they'll come around. Chan, give it time, the kind of smoothing over that people offer when they want you to stop asking about things that might be complicated. "How difficult," she said. "Harlan Briggs is my foreman. He's good at his job and he doesn't like change. He won't be actively rude, but he won't make it easy. And the others follow his lead. Most of them." Rosalie looked out at the landscape. The road was descending into a valley she didn't recognize, the grass gray gold in the October light, a line of cottonwoods along a creek bed burning yellow against the sky. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Colton glanced at her briefly. Something moved across his face, surprise. Maybe, though it was subtle enough that she might have imagined it. "I'd rather you know what you're walking into," he said. She nodded. Ahead of them, at the end of the road, she could see the shape of the ranch buildings beginning to resolve. Out of the valley, the main house, the bunkhouse, the outbuildings, the corrals. Large, significantly larger than she'd expected, though she'd known the numbers. Numbers and the actual sight of a thing were different. This was her home now, or it was supposed to be. She pressed her hands together in her lap and said nothing, and the wagon rolled on down the hill into the valley. What happened when they arrived? What Harlan Briggs said under his breath when Colton helped her down from the wagon seat, the precise quality of the silence that fell over the yard as the ranch hands stopped what they were doing to look at her. She filed each of those things away carefully, the way she had been filing things away her entire life. She was going to need them later. Harlan Briggs didn't say anything when Colton helped Rosalie down from the wagon. He didn't have to. He stood at the edge of the yard, with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and looked at her the way a man looks at a purchase he thinks was overpriced. And then he looked at Colton with an expression that asked a question. Colton answered by not answering it, by simply handing the reins to the nearest hand and saying, "Mrs. Hayes, I'll show you the house. Mrs. Hayes." The words landed strangely. Not badly. Just strangely, the way your own name sounds odd when a stranger says it. She followed Colton across the yard without looking at Briggs again. She was aware, in the way you are aware of weather, of the other men, 4 of them visible, 2 near the corral, 1 at the water pump, 1 coming out of the barn with a saddle over his arm, and of the particular quality of their attention. It wasn't hostile, exactly. It was assessing, the way men assess things they expect to have opinions about later. Peltic shit. She kept her back straight and her chin level and walked at a pace that suggested she was going somewhere she intended to be, not somewhere she'd been sent. The main house was larger than she'd let herself picture. 2 stories, timber and stone, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and wrapped around the east side. The windows were real glass, which meant money, and the door was heavy and well hung, which meant someone had cared about the building. Inside it was clean enough, but spare the kind of clean that comes from someone keeping the surfaces clear without much thought for the spaces between, the corners, the places where a household either breathes or doesn't. Colton walked her through the main rooms without ceremony. Parlor, dining room, his study, door half open, which he didn't enter. Kitchen at the back, where Alma was at the stove and turned around when they came in with the expression of a woman who has been told to expect something and has already decided how she feels about it. Alma was perhaps 60, lean as rawhide, with gray hair pinned back so firmly it looked structural. She looked at Rosalie the way a customs officer looks at a document, checking for irregularities. "Mrs. Hayes," Colton said, "this is Alma." "I know who she is," Alma said, to Colton, not to Rosalie. Then to Rosalie, "I run this kitchen, I heard," Rosalie said. "I don't intend to interfere with it." Alma's eyes moved over her once, up and down, and then back to her face, where they stayed. "Colton says you keep accounts." "I do. The household accounts have been a mess since Mrs. Garfield left. She was the last housekeeper. Stayed 14 months. "I'm not a housekeeper," Rosalie said. "I'm his wife." Came out steadier than she felt. Alma blinked a small fractional thing, and then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't hostility either. "Supper's at 6, Alma said, and turned back to the stove. Colton showed her upstairs without comment. The room he'd prepared was large, at the front of the house, with 2 windows overlooking the yard. There was a bed, a dresser, a washstand, a small writing table near the window with a chair that had seen better days. It was not a shared room. She hadn't expected it to be, and the relief she felt confirmed that the arrangement was exactly what she'd taken it to be: practical, at its core, whatever it might or might not become. "I'm across the hall," Colton said, "if you need anything." "I'll be fine," she said. He nodded and left, and she stood in the middle of the room for a moment, with her trunk at her feet and the sound of the ranch below the window's horses, the distant call of a man's voice, the clank of something metal, and she thought, "All right, this is the situation. Work with it." She unpacked her trunk. The first week was a study in being invisible in a place where everyone was watching you. It was a particular skill Rosalie had developed over years of being in rooms where people looked at her to find fault. You learned to read the temperature of a space before you entered it. You learned which battles mattered and which ones only looked like they mattered. You learned that the people making the most noise were rarely the ones who would actually determine your position. It was the quiet ones, the ones who waited, who made up their minds slowly and didn't announce it. Harlan Briggs was the noise. Every time she came into the yard, or crossed from the house to the outbuildings, she could feel him tracking her the way you track something you've decided is out of place. He never said anything directly. Colton's presence was a constraint the man clearly respected, if not welcomed, but his comments floated to her on the wind in fragments, remarks to other men that ended in low laughter, the particular silence that falls over a group when the person being discussed walks into earshot. She didn't react. Reaction was what he was after. What she did instead was work. The household accounts were, as Alma had indicated, a disaster. Not through malice, the previous system had simply been nobody's job in particular, which meant it had accumulated 3 seasons of guesswork and optimism in the ledgers. Rosalie spread everything out on the dining room table the second morning and spent 2 days working through it, and when she had a clear picture, she went to Colton's study and knocked. "Come in." He was at his desk with his own papers, ranch operation records. She could see the format. He looked up when she entered. "The household accounts," she said, and put her notes on the desk in front of him. "There are a few things you should know." He looked at the notes. Then he looked at her. "How bad?" "Not catastrophic. But there's been consistent overspending on supply orders because no one was comparing against inventory before ordering. You've been buying flour and salt pork and lamp oil that you already had. Over 3 seasons, it adds up." Colton looked at the figures for a moment without speaking. "I can fix it," she said. "I'll need access to the full supply orders, and I'll need whoever handles the purchasing to go through me first." "That's Briggs." She had known it would be. "I know. He won't like it." "I imagine not." Colton looked at her steadily. "You're not going to ask me to smooth it over with him first." "Would it help if you did?" A pause. "Probably not." "Then there's no point in waiting," she said. He nodded once, and the way she was learning was his version of a full sentence. "Tell him the supply orders go through the house now." She took her notes back. "Thank you." She was at the door when he said Rosalie turned. "The previous housekeeper found Briggs difficult," he said. "She avoided confrontation. Things got worse." "I don't avoid confrontation," she said. "I just choose the timing." Something moved in his face. That same thing she'd seen before the fractional shift she couldn't fully read. "Fair enough," he said. The confrontation with Briggs happened 4 days later, which was long enough for her to have established that she knew what she was talking about, and short enough that he hadn't fully adjusted to her presence yet. That was the timing she'd chosen. She met him at the supply wagon when it came in from Harlow, 2 weeks' worth of orders, already loaded, and she stood at the wagon with her inventory list and went through it item by item with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of work since before most of the men on this ranch had left home. "What are you doing?" Briggs said. Not a question, the way he said it. "Checking the order against what we have," Rosalie said, without looking up from the list. "I placed that order, I know, and it's mostly correct. But you ordered 40 pounds of salt pork when we have 60 pounds already in the cellar. And 3 gallons of lamp oil when there's a full case in the storeroom that no one's opened." Silence. "Going forward," she said, "orders will come through me first. I'll keep a running inventory so we're not buying what we have." She could feel him behind her, the specific quality of stillness that meant a man was deciding how far to push something. "That's ranch business," he said. "Household supply is household business," she said. "Which is mine." She looked at him then, directly, the way she'd looked at the women at her wedding. "I'm not questioning your management of the cattle operation. I'm managing the household accounts. Those are 2 different things, and I expect we both know it." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. His face was weathered and closed, the face of a man who had been in charge of things for long enough that he'd stopped remembering what it felt like not to be. "Colton know about this arrangement," he said. "He said it," she said. Another silence, longer this time. Then Briggs turned and walked away without another word, which was not agreement and was not acceptance, but was, for now, the absence of open war. She put a check mark beside the salt pork and kept working. It was Alma who shifted first. Rosalie hadn't pushed her. She'd stayed out of the kitchen, except to go through the supply lists, she asked. She didn't assume access, and she was thorough and quiet when she had it. 3 days into the second week, Alma appeared in the dining room where Rosalie was working and set a cup of coffee on the table beside her, without being asked. Rosalie looked up. "You take sugar," Alma said. It wasn't a question. She'd apparently noticed. "Thank you," Rosalie said. Alma stood for a moment, looking at the spread of papers on the table. "You found the salt pork thing. It's been going on since last spring, from what I can tell." Alma made a sound that communicated several things at once: vindication, irritation, the particular satisfaction of someone who had known something was wrong and hadn't been in a position to say it. "I told the last woman," she said. She smiled and wrote it down, and nothing happened. "I'm not writing it down to be polite," Rosalie said. "I'm fixing it." Alma looked at her for another moment. Then she went back to her kitchen. But the coffee kept appearing. It was during the 3rd week that Rosalie began to understand the shape of the ranch's real problem, not the household accounts. which were fixable, but the morale of the men, which was something more complicated. She pieced it together, the way she pieced most things together, by paying attention to things that weren't said directly, the way certain conversations stopped when she appeared, the way two of the younger hands, a boy named Pete and another called Denny, watched Briggs before they did anything else, as though checking which way the wind was blowing. The way Briggs himself, for all his surface compliance with Colton's authority, managed the men in ways that kept them oriented toward him rather than the ranch itself. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that became a large thing slowly, the way water works at stone. She didn't say anything about it yet. She didn't have evidence, only a feeling, and a feeling without evidence was just anxiety wearing a coat. But she kept watching. Colton, she was learning, was not an unobservant man. He was simply a man who had built his system of management around trust, who relied on his foreman because he'd found Briggs competent and hadn't looked past the competence to what else might be living in the same house. It wasn't naivety. It was the particular blind spot of a man who was very good at running the large things and had been alone long enough that the human texture of what he'd built had gone unmaintained. She watched him, too, the way she watched everything on this ranch. He was careful with people, not warm, but careful. He didn't snap at the men, didn't make examples of anyone publicly, didn't put on a performance of authority. He simply was the authority, the way a mountain is the mountain, without needing to announce it. She respected that. She hadn't expected to respect things about him this quickly. What she hadn't expected at all was the Thursday evening near the end of the third week, when she was in the parlor with the lamplit, working through supply projections for the winter, and he came in from the cold with mud on his boots and stopped when he saw her there. "Don't let me disturb you," she said. "You're not." He sat down in the chair by the fire, which she'd built up because the evening had turned genuinely cold, and pulled off his boots. And there was something in the ordinariness of the moment that she felt as a small warmth in the chest, the strange domestic reality of two people sharing a space that was not performance, was not transaction, was just two people in a room at the end of a day. "Long day," she said. "Lost a calf to a fence break on the east quarter. Pete didn't report it fast enough." He rubbed his face. "Could have been worse. Pete checks with Briggs before he reports to you," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out levelly, the way factual things come out when you've been holding them too long. Colton looked at her. "I've noticed it," she said. "I'm not accusing Briggs of anything. I'm telling you what I've observed." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to observe." "I know. That's why I said it." He looked at the fire. His expression was not angry. It was the look of someone running a thing back through memory, checking it against new information. "How long?" "I've been watching for 2 weeks. It may have been longer than that." He nodded. Slow, deliberate. "Thank you for telling me. You'd have seen it eventually. Maybe." He looked at her. "But you saw it first." She returned to her figures. He sat by the fire for another hour, and neither of them spoke much, but it was not the silence of strangers anymore. The morning of the 19th day, she walked into the yard to find 3 of the ranch hands gathered by the water trough, and she heard her name, not her name, her other name, the one that required no words, the one carried in the particular tone men use when they find something ridiculous. She stopped. One of the hands, a man called Gus, who had been on the ranch 4 years, and whose face she associated primarily with the expression of someone smelling something unpleasant, was speaking to the other 2 with his back to her. Caught the shape of it without catching all the words. "Colton and debt and a low laugh, and couldn't pay me enough." The other 2 saw her before Gus did. Their faces changed. Not with guilt, exactly, it was a subtler shift. The look of men who've been caught, but don't think they've done anything wrong. Gus turned around. He was not a small man. He looked at her from across the yard with the expression she'd been cataloging since childhood, the one that said, "You're here, but you shouldn't be." "Morning," she said. He said nothing. She walked to the barn to check on the inventory she'd been working through, and she did not hurry. And she did not shake until she was inside the barn and out of sight. And she stood there for a moment with her hand on the wooden post and let herself feel it, the specific ugliness of being assessed and dismissed, the small particular violence of it. And then she breathed and she let it pass through, and she went on with what she was doing. because she was Rosalie Hayes, and she had been carrying this weight her whole life, and she was not going to put it down in a barn to save the feelings of a man who wasn't worth the dirt on her boots. That evening, Colton found her in the dining room. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the way she'd learned meant he was controlling his temper. "Gus," he said. She looked up from her work. "I heard what he said this morning." She put her pen down. "Who told you, Alma?" Of course it was Alma. She felt something complicated about that gratitude, and also the slight deflation of having been protected when she hadn't asked to be. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did. I'm handling the rest of it." "Colton, a man who talks about my wife like that in my yard is gone," he said. Simply, flatly, the way he said everything. "That's not negotiable." She looked at him for a moment. "And Briggs, not yet, but I'm watching now." She picked up her pen. "All right." He put his hat back on. He was almost out the door when she said, "Thank you." Stopped. Didn't turn around. "I should have dealt with the tone on this ranch before you arrived," he said. "That's on me." Then he was gone, and she sat in the quiet of the dining room with the lamplight and the cold pressing against the windows, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel this soon in this house. She felt like she was not alone in it. By the end of the first month, the household ran differently. The supply waste had been reduced to almost nothing. Alma had reorganized the cellar according to a system Rosalie had laid out, and then refused to take credit for, letting Alma present it as her own idea to the other women who came in to help with the heavy laundry, a small courtesy that cost Rosalie nothing and bought her something she hadn't had before, Alma as an ally rather than a neutral party. The men were still divided. Gus was gone, which had sent a clear signal, and two of the younger hands had quietly adjusted, not warmly, but without hostility. Briggs remained, and Briggs remained the problem, though it was a problem still wearing the shape of normal discontent. What changed without Rosalie planning for it to change was Colton. She noticed it in the way he began to speak to her at supper, the two of them at the long dining table, which had felt absurd in the first week, a piece of theater neither of them quite knew how to perform, but had become simply the time of day when they talked about the ranch. He started asking her things, not about the household, about the cattle operation, about the decisions he was weighing, about the winter preparations that were becoming more urgent as November pressed in with serious cold. "You don't have to do that," she said, one evening, when he'd asked her opinion on whether to sell off part of the herd before the hard freeze or hold them. He looked at her. "Do what? Include me in the ranch business." "That wasn't part of the agreement." "No," he said. "But you see things. I'd be wasting a resource not to use it." It was not romantic. It was practical. And she knew it. And she was on a short, ugly laugh, was honest enough with herself to know that the practical version was easier to accept than the romantic version would have been, because she didn't trust romantic versions of things. She trusted work. She trusted usefulness. Those were currencies she understood. "Hold half, sell half," she said. "Split the risk. If the winter's mild, you've still got the herd for spring. If it's hard, you've got the capital from the sales to cover the feed costs." He looked at her for a moment. "That's what I was leaning toward." "Then you didn't need my opinion. I wanted to hear if you came to the same place through a different road," he said. "Sometimes that tells you something." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. November arrived with a wind that had teeth in it, and with the wind came two things. The first serious snowfall of the season, which coated the valley in 8 inches overnight and transformed the ranch into a place that looked like a painting and functioned like a test, and a visit from 3 women who rode out from Harlow in a buggy that Rosalie saw coming up the road from the parlor window and immediately understood the purpose of. Women who came calling on a new bride were not always coming to welcome her. She had Alma put the good coffee on, and she went to the door, and she was standing on the porch when the buggy came to a stop in the yard. And she smiled the smile she'd developed over 22 years of being smiled at by people who meant it differently than they showed. Louise Tanner got out first. She was perhaps 35, handsome in the precise, preserved way of women who consider their appearance a serious project. She looked at Rosalie with eyes that were doing several calculations at once. "Mrs. Hayes," she said warmly, "we've been meaning to call." "Come in," Rosalie said. Alma's made coffee. The 3 women came in and sat in the parlor and drank the coffee and said all the things women say in these situations. And Rosalie listened and responded and did not offer more than was asked for, which was a skill she'd also had her whole life. She watched Louise Tanner's eyes move around the room, taking in the small changes Rosalie had made, the order of the space, the way the household breathed differently now, and she watched Louise process this with an expression that was working hard not to show what it was processing. It must be quite an adjustment, Louise said eventually. The ranch is so isolated. I grew up on a ranch, Rosalie said. Isolation is familiar, of course, but a ranch of this size. A small pause. Colton had been managing it alone for so long. It must be a significant change for him as well. You'd have to ask him, Rosalie said. Louise smiled. The smile had an edge on it, fine as a good blade. He seems a delicate hesitation. Content. Consider. Rosalie looked at her pleasantly. Considering what? She said. A silence that lasted precisely long enough to say everything. The adjustment, Louise said. For both of you. We're managing, Rosalie said. And she refilled Louise's coffee with the steady hand of a woman who has been in harder rooms than this one, and come out the other side. And she moved the conversation to the upcoming winter, and the Harlow trading post. And she never, not once, gave Louise Tanner the reaction she had ridden 2 hours in a cold buggy to collect. When they left, Alma came out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway and looked at Rosalie. Well, Alma said. Well, Rosalie agreed. Louise Tanner had her eye on this ranch for her daughter for 2 years running. I know, Rosalie said. You handled that. She's not my enemy, Rosalie said. She's just disappointed. That's different. Alma looked at her for a moment. You're an unusual woman, she said. Not warmly, Alma said almost nothing warmly, but with something in it that was close to respect. I've been told, Rosalie said and went back to work. The thing that she had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, was the night 3 weeks into November, when the temperature dropped to something serious, and the wind came down off the mountain with a sound that was not wind, as she understood wind but something meaner, and she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of cattle. Not lowing, something different, the specific pitch of animals in distress. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, and she pulled on her clothes in the dark, and she pulled on her of someone who grew up on a working ranch and knew the difference between sounds that could wait and sounds that couldn't. She was on the stairs when she heard Colton's door open across the hall. You heard it, he said. Yes. They went down together and into the cold, which was a cold that had physical weight to it, compressing through her coat before she'd made it 10 feet from the door. The sound was coming from the south pasture. Colton was already moving, and she was moving with him, and neither of them had discussed it, which was its own kind of statement about how things had shifted in a month. What they found was a section of fencing down the post, pulled clean out of the frozen ground, which didn't happen by accident, a fact that registered in the back of her mind and stayed there, and 40 head of cattle pushing toward the gap in the dark, and the cold, heading toward the open range where in this weather they'd scatter, and some of them would die before morning. What happened next was not graceful, and it was not easy, and it took 3 hours, and Colton and both of them in the freezing dark. Getting the cattle turned, and the gap blocked with what they had available timber from the supply shed. Her idea. He let out a short, ugly laugh, because the spare fence posts were on the wrong side of the property. And by the time it was done, her hands were so cold she could barely feel them. And there was something wrong with her left boot that she'd figure out later, and she was so tired. Could have sat down in the snow and not gotten up for a while. Colton stood beside her, looking at the blocked gap, breathing hard, his breath clouding in the cold. That post didn't come out on its own, he said. No, she said. It didn't. He looked at the dark beyond the fence line for a moment. Then he looked at her. You're shaking. I'm cold. Come inside. The fence is handled until morning. Come inside. She came inside. Alma, who had apparently not been sleeping, had the stove going and coffee on, and she put a cup in Rosalie's hands without comment, and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has decided, without making any announcement about it, which side she is on. Colton sat across the table and looked at his coffee and then looked at her. Someone pulled that post, he said. Yes, that's sabotage. He was quiet for a moment. Briggs was on watch tonight, he said. She said nothing. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and felt the warmth work its way into her fingers, and she looked back at him and let him think. Because he was a man who thought best without being pushed, and because she had already thought what needed to be thought, and she was waiting to see if he arrived at the same place. He did. I need to be careful, he said. I need to be sure. Yes, she said. You do. But I'm watching. I know, she said. So am I. The wind pushed at the windows. Somewhere outside, the cattle were settled. The ranch was quiet. But under the quiet, something had shifted in the last 3 hours, not just in the situation, but between them, in the specific way that two people who have stood in the cold and worked at the same problem and come back to the same table begin to understand that they are, whether or not either of them planned for it, on the same side of something. She finished her coffee. She said goodnight. She went up to her room and lay in the dark with her cold feet and her tired body, and her mind still running through what she'd seen at the fence, the angle of the pulled post, the cleanness of it. And she thought about Briggs, and she thought about the men who followed him, and she thought about what was coming. Because it was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. She just didn't know yet what form it would take. The storm came down from the north on a Tuesday, which nobody had predicted and everyone should have. Rosalie had felt it 2 days before, not in any mystical way, just in the way a woman who had grown up watching Montana's sky learned to read the particular color of the horizon at dusk, the way the cattle bunched without being moved, the way the temperature dropped 6 degrees between noon and 3 in the afternoon without the wind changing direction first. She had mentioned it to Colton at supper Monday evening, said she thought they had less time than the almanac suggested, and he had looked at her across the table with the expression she was learning to read as serious attention, and said he'd move up the feed distribution to the north pasture. He moved it up. It wasn't enough. By Tuesday morning, the sky had gone the color of old pewter from one edge of the valley to the other, and the wind had a sound in it that made the horses nervous in their stalls and made Alma fill every available pot with water and set them near the stove without anyone asking her to. By noon, the first snow was coming in sideways. By 3 o'clock, you couldn't see the barn from the house. Colton had gone out with Briggs and 4 of the men to check on the north herd before the storm hit fully, and they hadn't come back yet. That was not immediately alarming. Men on horseback in a working ranch don't always come back on schedule. But by 4 o'clock, with the visibility down to nothing and the temperature dropping through the floor, Rosalie was standing at the parlor window, watching the white, nothing outside, and doing arithmetic in her head that she didn't like the results of. Alma came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "He knows this land," Alma said. "Yes," Rosalie said. "He's been through worse." "I know." They stood there another minute. Then Rosalie turned from the window and went to check on the supply of lamp oil. He let out a short, ugly laugh, because standing at windows didn't accomplish anything, and there was still work to be done, and she was not the kind of woman who waited in a parlor while things happened around her. Colton came back at 5:30, ice in his beard, 2 of the men half frozen and needing Alma's stove immediately. He stood in the hallway and looked at Rosalie with an expression that told her, before he spoke, that something had gone wrong. "South herd," he said. 60 head that were in the lower pasture. "They're gone." She went still. Gone how? The gate on the south pasture fence was open. He said it flatly, the way he said things when he was controlling something underneath the words. Wide open. The herd pushed through and scattered before anyone knew. "That gate was latched yesterday morning," she said. "I walked past it. I know it was." They looked at each other. "Where's Briggs?" she said, dealing with the horses. A pause that meant something. "He's the one who found the gate open." She thought about the fence post in the night 3 weeks ago. Cleanness of how it had come out. She thought about Pete checking with Briggs before reporting things. She thought about the way the south pasture sat, relative to the rest of the property, the most exposed section, the hardest to recover cattle from in a storm, the one that would cause the most damage. "Colton," she said carefully, "the south pasture gate is on a drop latch. It doesn't blow open. It doesn't work loose. Someone has to lift it." His jaw set. Yes. And Briggs found it. Yes, the word sat between them like something sharp. She didn't push further. Not yet. He needed to think, and she needed information. And neither of those things happened in a hallway, with 2 frozen ranch hands dripping on the floor behind them. So she stepped back and said, "Get the men warmed up. I'll talk to you later." And she went to help Alma with the hot water and the blankets, and the business of bringing people back from the cold. And she kept her mind on the problem the way you keep a lamp flame steady in a draft, not by covering it, but by blocking the wind from the right angle. The storm didn't let up through the night or through the following morning. It settled in with the commitment of a season rather than a weather event, piling snow against the outbuildings until the doors needed clearing every 2 hours. dropping the temperature low enough that the water in the upstairs washstand froze solid before dawn. The ranch became an island. Nothing came in from Harlow. Nothing went out. In the strange suspended world of a true blizzard, Rosalie did two things simultaneously. She kept the household running, and she went through every record she could access. She had full access to the household accounts. She had, over the past month, also been given access to the supply logs. Colton had arranged it, practically, because the supply orders ran through her now, and she needed the history to do that job. What she had not had was time to look at those logs in detail, beyond what she needed for the ordering. She had time now. She spread everything on the dining room table the second morning of the storm, with the snow still coming sideways, past the windows, and the lamp burning at noon, because the light outside was the color of nothing. Alma brought her coffee without being asked, and looked at the papers spread across the table, and asked no questions, which was its own kind of support. The logs went back 18 months. She started at the beginning and worked forward. At first it was ordinary supply deliveries, quantities, costs, the routine record of a large working ranch, consuming what it consumed. She checked the figures against the household accounts she'd already cleaned up, cross-referencing. Most of it aligned. Some of it didn't, in the small, unremarkable ways that imperfect record-keeping produces, an entry here that didn't match, a quantity there that was slightly off. She kept going. The pattern emerged in the cattle records, not the supply logs, which was where she'd been looking, but the transfer records that were filed behind them, which accounted for cattle moved between pastures, sold at market, or written off as loss. She almost missed them. They were filed carelessly, out of order, which she had assumed was sloppy bookkeeping and now reconsidered. In the last 8 months, the loss column had grown. Not explosively, not in a way that would have triggered an immediate alarm, but steadily 3 head written off in March, 4 in June, 2 in August, 5 in October. All recorded as death by various causes: illness, fence breaks, predator damage. All signed off by Briggs as foreman, whose authority to record losses was established practice and hadn't been questioned. 23 head, over 8 months, written off as natural loss. She sat back and looked at the number. 23 head, at current market prices, was not a catastrophic sum. It was also not a small one, and the pattern, the regularity of it, loss every other month, always in amounts small enough to sit inside the noise of normal ranch operation, was not a pattern that happened by accident. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote the dates and amounts in a column and looked at the column for a long time. Then she went to find Colton. He was in the barn, which was where he'd been spending most of the storm, keeping an eye on the horses and the 2 ranch hands who'd drawn the worst positions in the rotation of outdoor work. She pushed through the snow to the barn door and got it open against the wind and stood inside for a moment, breathing the relative warmth of it, the smell of horses and hay and lantern oil, while her eyes adjusted. Colton was at the far end, checking on a mare that had been running a slight fever since Monday. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the barn and handed him the paper without preamble. He looked at it. She watched his face while he read the careful, controlled face of a man who had learned not to show things in his expression and who was, right now, failing at that, somewhat. "You found this in the transfer records," he said. "Yes, all signed by Briggs, all of them." He folded the paper once and looked at the barn floor. "This could be coincidence," he said. "Bad luck stacked up." "It could be," she said. "I don't think it is. Neither do I." He looked up. "But I can't accuse a man on a pattern in a ledger." "I'm more," she said. "I know. But Colton, with the herd gone from the south pasture on top of this," she stopped. "Those cattle aren't found. The numbers get worse. And whoever is responsible for the losses has a storm as cover for whatever happens next." He looked at her steadily. The barn around them was warm and quiet, the horses moving in their stalls, the snow audible against the roof, a hiss and a wait, constant, relentless. "I need to go out and look for the herd," he said. "I know. In this weather, I know what it is," she said. "You still need to go." He looked at her for a moment. "You should stay in the house." "I'm not going to stay in the house while you—" "Rosalie." Not sharp, just her name but with a weight in it. "I need someone at the house who I trust to keep watching. If Briggs does something while I'm out, I need eyes there." She looked at him. He meant it, she could tell. He meant it. And she also understood that it was not purely tactical. that there was something else in it, something she wasn't sure either of them had names for yet. She let it stand. All right, she said, but take Denny, not Pete. He raised an eyebrow. Pete still checks with Briggs first, she said. Denny's been different since last month. I think he's trying to figure out which way to land. Colton looked at her for another moment. You've been watching every one of them. I've been watching everything, she said. That's what I do. He took the paper she'd given him and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. I'll take Denny and Morgan. I'll leave Walsh at the house. He's reliable. Good. He started moving toward the barn door to gather what he needed, and she started back toward the house. And then he said he'd turn again, and she stopped and turned. The records, he said. Keep them with you. She patted her coat. She'd already put a copy in her inside pocket before she came to the barn. He almost smiled. It was a very small thing, a fractional movement at one corner of his mouth, but she saw it, and she filed it away with the other things she was keeping. He left with Denny and Morgan at just past noon, 3 figures on horseback, disappearing into the white within 50 yards of the barn. And Rosalie stood on the porch and watched them go, and then went inside to do what she had told him she would do. She watched. Walsh was a quiet man in his late 30s who had been with the ranch 6 years and had, as far as she could determine, a settled sense of where his loyalties sat. He didn't make conversation with her, but he stationed himself where she asked, and he didn't check with anyone else before he did it, and that was enough. Briggs came to the house at 2 o'clock. He knocked, which was itself a kind of message, a formality he didn't usually bother with, and when she opened the door, he stood there in the snow with his hat in his hands and an expression that was working at concern. Just checking on the household, he said. Storm's getting worse. We're fine, she said. Thank you for checking. She kept the door at a partial angle. He looked past her into the house the way men look when they're assessing something they're not willing to admit they're assessing. Colton's out looking for the south herd, he said. Dangerous weather for it. He knows the land, she said. Alma's words, back at her. Still, Briggs looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation, and there was something in it that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite a warning, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Ranch like this, things go wrong in a hard winter. A man can't account for everything. She looked back at him with the expression she'd been developing since childhood, the one that gave nothing away. No, she said. He can't. That's why it's important to have people around him he can trust. A silence between them that had a shape to it. I've been with this ranch 5 years, Briggs said. I know, she said. Good evening, Briggs. She closed the door. She went to the parlor window and watched him cross back to the bunkhouse. And she thought about the way he'd said things go wrong in a hard winter, and she thought about 23 head, written off in 8 months, and she thought about South Pasture, and she thought about the fence post pulled out of the frozen ground 3 weeks ago, while Briggs was on night watch. She went to the dining room and looked at the records again. There was something she'd seen and not quite registered a name in the delivery logs, a buyer's name that appeared 3 times in the months corresponding to the loss entries, not a name she recognized. A ranch operation out of a county 2 over, which was far enough away that it wouldn't have connected in casual conversation, but close enough that cattle could be moved there without an overnight trail drive. She wrote the name down and looked at it. Delacroix Cattle, Mercer County. She didn't know who Delacroix was, but the entries showed 3 payments, small amounts, recorded as compensation for cattle returned. After straying onto Delacroix Range, which was a plausible enough story for each individual entry, and was taken together, a pattern that told a different story entirely. Cattle didn't stray into Mercer County from the Hayes South Pasture. Mercer County was 40 miles away. You didn't lose cattle to a ranch 40 miles away by accident. You lost them because someone moved them there. Colton came back at nightfall with 8 of the 60 head, and frostbite on 2 fingers of his left hand that Alma wrapped with grim efficiency while he sat at the kitchen table and said nothing about the pain. Rosalie sat across from him and waited until Alma was done. Delacroix Cattle, she said. Mercer County. He looked up from his hand. She put the paper in front of him, the name, the 3 entries, the dates aligned against the loss records. He read it once and then read it again. And she watched the controlled face lose some of its control in a way that was not anger exactly, but was the thing underneath anger, when a man realizes he has been systematically deceived by someone he gave his trust to. Briggs has family in Mercer County, he said, very quietly. She had not known that. It landed in the room and settled. How long has he known the Delacroix operation? She said. I don't know. Long time, possibly. He came here from that region. He looked at the paper. I brought him here. I vouched for him. He set the paper down. 52 cattle still out in this. Some of them may have sheltered in the creek timber, she said. The south draw has cover. If they pushed east before the storm fully hit. I looked east. Not the south draw. That's a half-mile past where you'd normally look. Cattle in a panic coming out of a gate that's been opened deliberately. In the early edge of a storm, they run with the wind first, and then they look for shelter. The wind was coming from the northwest yesterday. That pushes them southeast. She had the rough geography in her head, Judd. She'd been building it since she arrived. The way she built all useful knowledge, piece by piece, without announcing it. The south draw is southeast. He looked at her. You know where the south draw is. I know where everything on this property is, she said. I've been walking it since November. He looked at the table, at his wrapped hand, at the paper with Delacroix written on it. I can't go back out tonight. No, she said, you can't. The unspoken thing sat in the room. Rosalie, I know the route, she said. I know the draw. I know what I'm looking for. It's a blizzard. It's easing. The snow was lighter when you came in than when you left. She had been watching. In 2 hours it'll be down enough to ride. 2 hours is still dark. There's a moon behind the clouds. When the snow lightens, there'll be enough light. She looked at him steadily. Colton, if those cattle are in the south draw and we leave them overnight, some of them won't make the morning. The temperature is still dropping. I'm not sending you out and... You're not sending me, she said. I'm going. The silence between them was different from previous silences. It had a different texture, not the silence of strangers establishing terms, not the careful quiet of two people learning each other's shape, but something with more friction in it, more reality. Walsh will go with you, he said. Walsh should stay here. In case Briggs Denny, then. She thought about it. Denny had been trying to land somewhere, she'd said. This was a direction to land in. All right, Denny? Colton looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. It had too many things in it at once. You come back, he said. Just that. I intend to, she said. She and Denny left at 10 o'clock when the snow had thinned enough that she could see 30 feet in front of the horse. The moon was a pale smear of light behind the clouds that was better than nothing. The cold was the kind that got into your bones in the first 5 minutes and stayed there, and she had put on every layer she had, and still felt it in her face and her hands immediately. Denny rode beside her, without much conversation, which she appreciated. He was 23, she thought, maybe 24, with a young man's face that was trying to look like it knew what it was doing, and mostly succeeding. He had good instincts on horseback. She'd noticed that before tonight. South draw is past the second fence line, she said. We'll go along the creek bed. The snow won't be as deep there. The banks give some shelter. Yes, ma'am, he said. They picked their way through the dark and the cold and the diminished but still serious snow, and she navigated by memory and by the shape of the land under the white, the rise and fall of it, the direction of the creek sound when it came to her through the wind, the angle of the mountains against the pale sky. She had been walking this land for 6 weeks. She knew it well enough. 20 minutes out, Denny said quietly, Mrs. Hayes. Can I ask you something? Go ahead, Briggs said before the storm. He said that when the South herds went missing, it was going to be the final proof that you didn't know how to manage things. Colton would see it. He paused. He said it to Pete. I was behind the supply shed, and they didn't know I was there. Kept her eyes on the ground ahead. When did he say this? Yesterday morning. Before Colton found out about the gate. She thought about the timing of that. Before Colton found out. Which meant Briggs had known about the gate before Colton did, because Briggs had opened it. Denny, she said carefully, I need you to be willing to say that. Colton, to whoever needs to hear it. A pause. Briggs has a long reach, the young man said. He does, she agreed. Right now, that reach is going to get shorter. Another pause, longer. She could feel him weighing at the calculation of a young man who had been orienting himself around the strongest force in the room and was trying to determine whether the strongest force in the room had changed. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. I'll say it. They found the cattle in the south, draw 40 minutes later, not all of them, not 52, but 31 head huddled in the creek timber, exactly where she had said they would be, alive and miserable and too cold to be difficult about being moved. Getting them out of the draw and moving them back through the snow and the dark to the nearest shelter pasture took an hour and a half of work that left both her and Denny soaked through despite the cold, her horse working hard beneath her, cattle lumbering and reluctant, and ultimately too exhausted to resist. When the last of them was through the pasture gate and Denny had it latched behind them, she sat on her horse in the dark and looked at the 31 animals finding their way to the covered section of the pasture and felt something in her chest that was not triumph. It was too tired for triumph, but was solid, was real, was the particular satisfaction of a thing done that needed doing. 31, Denny said. His voice was rough with cold. 31, she agreed. They rode back to the house. Colton was awake and at the kitchen table when they came in, and he stood when she came through the door. And she told him 31 before he could ask, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not relief exactly. Not the simple, uncomplicated version of it, but something larger than relief, something that included relief, and also something else that he didn't put into words, and she didn't push him to. Alma put hot water on without a word, and Walsh took the horses, and Denny sat in the kitchen looking like a man who had surprised himself and was still taking the measure of it. Rosalie sat at the table and put her hands around the hot cup. Alma sat in front of her and felt the cold begin to work its way out of her fingers. Slowly, reluctantly. The way cold always left, not all at once, but in stages, degrees. Denny has something to tell you, she said to Colton. Denny told him. Colton listened without interrupting, and his face went through several things while he listened, and when Denny was finished, there was a silence in the kitchen that had the quality of a decision being arrived at. All right, Colton said. He looked at Denny. Thank you for telling me. Denny nodded and looked at his coffee. Colton looked at Rosalie. The records, he said, and Denny's account, and the fence post in November. He was putting it together aloud, which she understood as something he didn't often do, think out loud in front of another person. That's enough. Almost, she said, almost. The Delacroix name in the ledger. You need to know who Delacroix is and how the money moved. I can ride to Mercer County when the storm clears. Or you can write to the county recorder's office and ask about property registered to Delacroix and anyone associated with the name. She pulled the folded paper from her coat, the copy she'd made, the one he had told him she was keeping. And you can ask the Harlow sheriff to hold the inquiry there, not in Mercer, because you don't know yet how far the arrangement goes. He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. You've thought all of this through already, he said. I've had a blizzard to think in, she said. He looked at her for another moment. That long, steady look she was becoming familiar with, the one that went further than most people's looking. And then he put the paper in his pocket beside the other one and says, get some rest. I will, Rosalie. She was halfway out of the kitchen, 31 head in a blizzard in the dark. She stopped. Didn't turn around. Yes, she said. On your own account. Denny was there. You know what I mean. She did know. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and she let herself feel it. The cold still in her bones. The tiredness that went all the way through. The 31 animals, safe in the pasture, because she had known where to look and had been willing to go, and she let herself have it without diminishing it, which was something she had not always been able to do. Good night, Colton, she said, and went upstairs. Storm broke on Thursday. By Friday morning, the sky was the particular hard blue of a Montana winter after a blow. Everything white and still and scoured clean, and Harlan Briggs walked into the barn at 7 in the morning and found Colton Hayes waiting for him with the racks on the saddles rack and Walsh and Denny on either side of the door. Rosalie was not there. She was in the house, at the dining room table, working through the winter supply projections that needed to be done, regardless of everything else. And she listened to the raised voices from the barn. Briggs's voice. First, the voice of a man who'd been caught and was trying one more time to redirect the situation. And then Colton's, lower, harder, final. Alma came to the dining room doorway and stood. It's done, Alma said a few minutes later. Rosalie put her pen down. Is he gone? Walsh is taking him to Harlow. Colton's going to the sheriff. Rosalie looked at the papers in front of her. The supply projections, the inventory, the numbers that needed working through, regardless of who was foreman, and who was on a horse to the sheriff's office, and what had happened in the last 72 hours. There'll need to be a new foreman, she said. Yes, Alma said. Denny's too young, but he's a place to start from. Alma was quiet for a moment. You've already thought about this. I've been thinking about this ranch since I got here, Rosalie said. Alma came fully into the room and sat down in the chair across from her, which she had never done before, always stood, always in motion, never sitting. She looked at Rosalie across the table with an expression that had worked its way. Over the past 6 weeks, long distance from the customs officer inspection of that first day in the kitchen. The men who were laughing at you when you arrived, Alma said. Some of them, Rosalie said. They're not laughing now. Rosalie picked up her pen. No, she said, they're not. Outside, the snow was brilliant in the morning sun, throwing light back off every surface until the whole valley seemed to be made of something that burned cold and clean. And somewhere in the yard, Colton was saddling his own horse to ride to Harlow, with Walsh and Briggs, and the evidence that Rosalie had found in the records on a dining room table in the middle of a blizzard. She thought about what he'd said in the kitchen. You know what I mean? She did know, and she was beginning to understand that knowing what Colton Hayes meant and having him know what she meant was not a small thing in this life she had walked into on a cold October afternoon with one trunk and no expectations. It was not a small thing at all. But she did not let herself look at that too directly yet. There was still too much to do, and too much between them that hadn't been said, and she had learned a long time ago that you didn't count on a thing until it was real enough to hold in your hands. She turned back to her figures. The ranch needed a foreman. The South herd needed to be fully accounted for. The Delacroix matter needed to run its course through the sheriff's office and whatever came after. There would be costs she couldn't yet calculate, and repairs she couldn't yet fully plan for, and a dozen practical problems standing in a queue. She put her pen to paper and started on the first one. The sheriff's office in Harlow was a single room with a wood stove that worked unevenly, and a deputy who wrote slowly, and Colton spent 4 hours there on Friday giving his account, while Walsh waited outside with the horses, and Briggs sat in the back room behind a locked door that the sheriff kept glancing at like he expected it to do something. Rosalie knew the broad shape of it because Colton told her when he came back, which he did without being asked. Sitting down at the dining room table where she was still working, she had moved from supply projections to the cattle loss documentation, building a full account of what had gone missing and when and what it was worth, and going through it with the same flat, factual delivery he used for everything. The sheriff had sent a wire to Mercer County. The Delacroix name was known there, a small operation, 2 men, neither of whom owned significant property. One of them was Briggs's brother-in-law, which connected the arrangement in the way Rosalie had suspected it would connect. The cattle that had been moved, not all 23 written off, but a portion of them, the ones that hadn't simply been sold quietly at a market, 3 counties over had been running on Delacroix, range under a different brand, which was the kind of thing that took patience and planning and a particular contempt for the man you were stealing from. 5 years, Colton said. He was looking at the table. He was here 5 years. The losses only started 8 months ago, she said, based on the records that you found, that were there to be found. She said it carefully. Not as a correction, but as a distinction. They weren't well hidden. Someone who was looking would have found them. Nobody was looking. No, he was quiet for a moment. The ranch outside the window was white and still. The storm's aftermath settled over everything. The afternoon light already thinning toward the early dark of December. He'd been building something, Colton said. The men oriented toward him. The losses accumulating. The South herd in the storm that was supposed to be the thing that broke it made the whole operation look mismanaged enough that he stopped. That you'd reconsider the household arrangements, she said. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it, she said. The timing. He started the losses in March. That's 3 months before you made the arrangement with my father. Couldn't have known about that. But when it happened when I arrived, he saw it as an opportunity. A new wife, a transaction marriage, a woman everyone was already laughing at. If the ranch went badly wrong in the first season, the obvious person to blame was the new addition. Colton's jaw was tight. He said something to you, he said, on the porch during the storm. He suggested that things go wrong in hard winters and that a man can't account for everything. She paused. He was telling me that he had the capacity to make things go wrong and that I should understand that. That's a threat. It was offered as a friendly observation. Colton stood up from the table and went to the window and stood there with his back to her. For a moment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the specific set of a man who is angry at himself more than at the person who wronged him. which was the harder kind of anger to sit with. I should have seen it, he said. You trusted him. That's not the same as being blind. It's the same result. She didn't argue with that, because he wasn't wrong, and he didn't need comfort. He needed to work through it. And she had learned enough about Colton Hayes in 2 months to know that working through things was not a process that benefited from interruption. After a moment, he turned back from the window. The sheriff is holding him pending the Mercer County wire. Brand evidence holds up. It goes to the circuit court in spring. He looked at her. They'll want your records. I'll have them ready, she said. He nodded and sat back down, and she went back to the documentation she was building. And they worked in the same room, in the same silence. They'd been building for 2 months the comfortable, functional kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The news traveled to Harlow faster than news, usually traveled anywhere, which was to say within 48 hours. Everyone in the county knew that Harlan Briggs had been arrested, and that the evidence against him had been found by the new Mrs. Hayes. Rosalie knew the news was traveling because Alma told her the particular economy of information that characterized everything. Alma said 3 sentences, all the essential facts, no embellishment. What she had not anticipated was Louise Tanner. Louise came alone this time, no buggy full of companions, just her, and a hired horse on a Tuesday afternoon when the roads were passable enough, and the sky was the thin, hard blue of a cold, clear day. She knocked at the front door and Rosalie answered it. And Louise stood on the porch, looking different than she had the last time, less composed, more something else. May I come in? Louise said. Rosalie stood aside. They sat in the parlor, and Alma brought coffee without being asked, which was its own statement, and Louise looked around the room the same way she had on her first visit, but with a different quality of attention, not the inventory of a woman assessing a rival's position, but something more like recalibration. I owe you an apology, Louise said. She said it like a woman who has practiced it and is still finding it harder than the practice. Rosalie waited. When you arrived, Louise said. I was a pause. I was unkind, not to your face. But I said things I shouldn't have said, in company I shouldn't have said them to, and those things circulated. She looked at her coffee cup. I imagine you heard some version of them. I heard enough, Rosalie said. Louise nodded. Her hands around the cup were still. What you did for this ranch. Finding what Briggs was doing. Going out in that storm, she looked up. My husband said the South Draw in that weather was. He said a man would have had to think hard about that ride. I'm not a man, Rosalie said. I just knew where the cattle were. Louise looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected. I know, Rosalie said. What did you expect? A longer pause. Someone who would be easier to dismiss, Louise said, with an honesty that seemed to cost her something. Rosalie looked at her. She could have been gracious in the way that emphasizes the other person's smallness by contrast. Could have been cool, which would have been satisfying in a small way. Instead, she thought about what Louise actually was, under the social machinery, a woman in a small town who ran her position there with the only tools she'd been given, which were not so different from the tools Rosalie had been given, even if they'd been applied in different directions. Thank you for coming, Rosalie said. It was a difficult thing to do. Louise looked at her, and something in her face loosened by a fraction. Not friendship, they were not going to be friends, at least not immediately, and Rosalie didn't pretend otherwise. But the beginning of something that might, in time, become a kind of honest mutual regard. Your household accounts, Louise said, shifting. I've heard you reorganize the entire supply system. I corrected some inefficiencies, Rosalie said. My husband's ranch has... Louise stopped, started again. We've been having trouble with our books since our previous man left. I'm not available for hire, Rosalie said. But if you want to talk through the methodology, I'm happy to explain what I did here. Louise blinked. This was apparently not the response she'd expected either. I'd like that, she said. They talked for an hour. By the time Louise left, the conversation had moved from apology into something more practical and considerably more interesting. And Rosalie stood on the porch in the cold and watched her ride back down the road toward Harlow and thought that the world was not divided neatly into people worth your time and people who weren't, and let out a short, ugly laugh, and that the second category shrank considerably when you stopped waiting for people to be better than they'd started out. December moved toward its end, and the ranch found its new footing slowly, the way all things find their footing, after a disruption not cleanly, not all at once. But in the accumulation of days in which the work got done and the patterns reestablished themselves, and the absence of Briggs stopped being a wound and became simply the space where a wound had been. Denny was not made foreman. He was not ready, as Rosalie had said, and as Denny himself seemed to understand with the self-awareness of a young man who had recently been forced to take stock of himself. What he was given instead was a provisional position extra responsibility. Colton watching him, a clear understanding that, if he continued on the trajectory of the blizzard night, the foreman question would revisit itself in the spring. Colton brought in a man named Harris from a ranch 2 counties over in January, a foreman in his late 40s who'd been looking for a new position since his previous employer sold out. Harris was quiet and thorough and treated Rosalie with the matter-of-fact respect of a man who had heard what had happened here and taken it as simple information about how things worked on this ranch. She appreciated the lack of drama in it. The ranch hands adjusted. Pete, who had been Briggs's closest follower among the remaining men, was awkward around her for 2 weeks, and then appeared at the kitchen door one morning to tell her that the east pasture fence had 3 broken posts from the storm weight with spit, which was information he had previously taken to Briggs. She thanked him and told Colton and wrote it into the repair schedule, and Pete went back to work without anyone making it a larger thing than it was, which was the right call, and she knew it. People were not fixed by a single gesture. They changed in the slow accumulation of smaller decisions, and the only way to get there was to not demand they arrive faster than they could move. It was in January that things shifted between her and Colton, and they shifted in the specific way things shift when they've been building for long enough that the ground changes under you, and you only notice when you look back and see how far you've come from where you started. The change announced itself in a small thing, which was how changes usually announce themselves in Rosalie's experience. She had been sick, not seriously a winter cold that had settled in her chest for 4 days, the kind of thing that didn't stop the work but made it significantly worse. She had kept working because the household didn't stop requiring management, because its manager had a chest cold, and she had managed to keep the worst of it from being visible, which was a habit she'd had her whole life. Don't be an additional burden. Colton noticed on the 3rd day. He came to find her in the dining room, where she was working through the spring supply planning with a cup of something Alma had made that tasted like regret and was supposedly medicinal, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You sound terrible," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Alma's been putting things in your coffee." "I know. I've been drinking them." He came into the room and stood near the table and looked at the spread of papers. "That can wait," he said. "It can't, really. If we don't get the spring orders in before February, we're paying premium prices for." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was something he'd been doing, more often lately sitting with her at the table instead of standing in the doorway. "What you did in November is the reason this ranch is in the condition it's in right now. You are allowed to be sick for 4 days without turning it into a liability." She looked at him over her cup of medicinal regret. "I'm not," she started. "You are," he said, not unkindly. You do this thing where you make yourself smaller, so you're not costing anything. I've watched you do it since October." He looked at her steadily. "You cost something. You're supposed to. That's what it means to be here." She was quiet for a moment. The thing he'd said landed differently than she expected, not as criticism, not as correction, but as something she recognized from a long way off, a thing she'd needed to hear and hadn't known she was waiting to. "The spring orders," she said. "We'll keep until you're well." She put down her pen. It was not a surrender. She didn't experience it as one. It was more like the particular relief of putting down something heavy for a sanctioned moment, being given permission she hadn't thought to ask for. "I'm going upstairs," she said. "Good." She was at the door when he said, "There's a letter from your mother. It came this morning." He held it out. "Alma put it with your mail." She took it. Clara had written too. She saw 2 letters. Her mother's careful hand and Clara's more fluid script. She hadn't had a letter from home since she arrived. She went upstairs and lay on her bed and read her mother's letter, which was careful and somewhat formal in the way her mother became formal when she was uncertain, and Clara's letter, which was warm and scattered and said 4 times in slightly different words that she hoped Rosalie was happy, which was the question Clara always asked when she didn't know what else to ask. Rosalie lay on the bed with both letters on her chest and looked at the ceiling and tried to work out what she would write back, which required first working out the answer to the question Clara kept asking. She was not unhappy. That was the clearest thing. She had not been unhappy here. She had been scared, and she had been angry, and she had been very cold and extremely tired, and she had been treated badly by some people, and surprisingly by others, but unhappy in the way she had understood happiness before October, particular gray weight of living in a place that had no use for her, and being reminded of it in small ways every day, was not the word for what she was. She fell asleep with the letter still on her chest and slept for 3 hours, which was the most she'd slept in 4 days, and woke up when the light had changed and someone had put a blanket over her that hadn't been there before. She looked at the blanket for a moment. Then she got up and went back to work. Confronted him in February, not angrily, not with the intention of confrontation. Actually, she had not planned it, which was unusual for her, since she almost always knew ahead of time what she was going to say and why. Came out of a conversation that had started as ordinary and turned into something else, the way conversations sometimes do when you've been two people living parallel lives that have been slowly converging without either of you formally acknowledging the direction of travel. They had been talking about the spring hiring Harris assessment of which hands to keep, which positions needed filling, what the budget could carry. It was a practical conversation, the kind they had 3 times a week at minimum now, the kind that had become the texture of her days here. She had been doing the arithmetic out loud, the way she'd started doing with him, because he seemed to genuinely want to hear the reasoning, and not just the conclusion, and he had been adding things she hadn't factored in, and it was the specific collaborative back and forth of 2 people who had learned each other's thinking well enough to complete it. And then she stopped. He noticed. "What?" he said. She looked at her paper. Then she looked at him. "I need to ask you something." "All right, this arrangement," she said. "When you came to my father, when you proposed the terms, what was it to you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet, the thinking quiet. "Practical solution to 2 problems," he said. And now, he looked at her. The fire in the parlor where they'd moved after supper was the only sound, and the dark outside the windows was the absolute dark of a Montana winter night with cloud cover. "What are you asking?" he said, carefully. "I'm asking whether I'm still a practical solution," she said, "or whether something else is happening that neither of us has discussed." Quiet this time was longer. She held it, the way you hold something delicate, not tightly, but with attention. "Something else is happening," he said. She had known it. She had known it the way you know a thing you've been not. Looking at directly for weeks, seeing it in your peripheral vision, letting it stay there, because looking at it straight required you to decide what to do with it. But knowing it and hearing it said out loud were different enough that she felt it move through her chest. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to hear it without trying to argue with it." He nodded once. "I will not stay in this marriage because we started in it," she said. "I will not stay because the original arrangement means I'm supposed to. I will not stay because it's easier than leaving, or because there's nowhere else to go, or because I've been here long enough that it's become habit." She looked at him steadily. "I've spent my whole life in situations people put me in without asking me. I made peace with this one because it was survival for my family. But I will not make it my permanent life on those terms." He was very still. "If there's a real reason to stay," she said, "I want to know what it is. From you," implied. The fire shifted. A log settled. Outside, somewhere distant, the sound of wind. Colton looked at her across the space between them, and she watched him work through whatever it was. He was working through, she could see the effort in him. The specific effort of a man who had been private his whole adult life and had built privacy into the architecture of everything, and was now being asked to open a door he had kept closed so long he'd half forgotten what was behind it. "You walked into this house," he said slowly, "and in 6 weeks, you knew more about what was wrong with it than I did after 5 years. You took the things that weren't working and you fixed them without being asked and without making a point of it. You told me things I needed to hear that nobody else had told me." He stopped, started again, "and then you rode out in a blizzard in the dark because the cattle needed finding and you knew where they were, and you came back." He looked at her. "I have been looking at you since November and seeing not the woman who came here as a solution to a problem. Something entirely different from that." She waited. "I don't say things well," he said. "That's a true fact about me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what I'm saying is, He stopped once more, and she could see it cost him something. The stopping and starting, the reaching for words that didn't come easily, that I would choose this. If we were starting over, I would choose you, not as a solution, as a choice. The room was quiet. She sat with it. She didn't respond immediately, which was the honest thing she needed to feel, whether it was true, whether it set right, whether it was the thing it presented itself as. She had spent her whole life being the person people settled for, and she knew the texture of that so well she could have identified it in the dark. This wasn't that texture. I haven't made this easy, she said finally. No, he said, you haven't. I'm not going to become easier. I know that. I'll always tell you things you don't want to hear. I'll always see what's wrong before I see what's right, and I'll say it. I know that too. She looked at him. And that's still the choice. That's the choice, he said. She was quiet for another moment. There was something she needed to ask, not to test him, but because it was a real question, and she had earned the right to real answers. Before you came to my father, she said, you said you asked around about me, specifically. Yes. What did they tell you? He looked at her steadily. That you were the one who kept that ranch running. That you'd been doing it for years and nobody'd given you credit for it. That you were too capable for the situation you were in. A pause. And that you weren't easy. She almost laughed. It surprised her she almost laughed. Who told you that? Your father's neighbor, Hendricks. Hendricks has never liked me. He respects you, Colton said. It looked like dislike. It was respect from someone who didn't know what to do with it. She sat with that too. The idea that Hendricks, who had given her nothing but the flint-eyed assessment of a man who found women in positions of competence vaguely unsettling, had said something to a stranger that amounted to respect it, was the kind of information that rearranged something small in you and took a moment to settle. I want to stay, she said. He looked at her. Not because I'm supposed to, she said, because I'm choosing it. That's different. I know the difference, he said. She believed him. That was the thing she was least prepared for, that she believed him. And that believing him was not an act of will or optimism, but simply a fact. The way gravity was a fact. The way the cold outside was a fact. She had spent enough time in close proximity to Colton Hayes to know the difference between a man who said what he meant and a man who said what worked. And he was the first kind, even when the first kind was harder. All right, she said. He let out a breath. It was a small thing barely visible, but she saw it. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The people who laughed, she said. In town, on this ranch, everywhere. I don't need a public defense. I've been defending my own ground my whole life, and I'm capable of continuing. But I need to know that what happened here, the blizzard, the records, all of it is something you see clearly and not something that gets minimized later when it's convenient. Why would I minimize it? Because men do, she said simply. Not always from cruelty. Sometimes from the habit of giving less weight to what women do. I'm telling you it's a habit I'll notice. He looked at her for a long moment. The ranch would have taken losses it couldn't recover from if you hadn't found what Briggs was doing. That's not a thing I'm capable of minimizing. It's a fact. Good, she said. They looked at each other across the room, the fire between them and the dark outside. And she felt the particular quality of the moment, not romantic in the soft focus way of stories, but real, which was better. Two people who had arrived at a difficult, honest place together, which was the harder achievement and the more durable one. The circuit court date for Briggs was set for April. The Mercer County evidence had come through the branded cattle, the transfer records, testimony from one of the Delacroix men who had apparently decided that protecting Briggs was not worth what he was being asked to risk, and the case was solid enough that the county attorney in Harlow told. Colton, he expected a conviction without much difficulty. Rosalie prepared her documentation and sent it with Colton to the county attorney's office in a packet she had organized with the same thoroughness she brought to the supply logs, chronological, cross-referenced, with a summary page that laid the pattern out, plainly enough that anyone could follow it. The county attorney, Colton reported back, had looked at the summary page and then looked up and asked who had prepared it. Colton had told him. The attorney had been quiet for a moment and then said that it was the clearest evidence summary he'd seen in 12 years of practice. Rosalie, when Colton told her this, said good and went back to what she was doing, which was the monthly accounts. Compliment was real, and she allowed herself to feel it, the satisfaction of work, recognized, but she didn't need it to confirm what she already knew about what she'd done. She had never needed that. In March, the snow began to ease off. the first tentative suggestion of a spring that was still weeks away but was coming. You could feel it in the quality of the light, the way it lasted differently at the end of the day, the way the horses changed when there was more sun. The ranch came alive in small increments, Harris overseeing fence repairs, Denny supervising the younger hands with a seriousness that suited him, the work expanding back outward from the survival mode of deep winter into something more like operation. Rosalie walked the south pasture in the first week of March, when the ground was still hard and pulling back from the grass in patches, and she stood at the gate that Briggs had opened in November and looked at the land beyond it, the route the cattle had taken in the dark, the direction of the storm wind, the way the ground fell toward the creek draw, where she and Denny had found them. She looked at it for a long time, not thinking about Briggs, not thinking about any of it in an angry way, just accounting for it the way she accounted for all things, filing it properly, putting it in the right place in the ledger of what this life had been and what it was going to be. Colton came up beside her. She hadn't heard him, but she wasn't startled. She'd learned the particular weight of his footsteps. "Fence is solid," he said. "Harris put new posts the whole east section." "I know, I checked it Tuesday." "Of course you did." She could hear something in it, not resignation. The other thing, the thing underneath teasing, which was affection. She was still getting used to that. "Spring hiring starts next week," she said. "Harris has the list. I want to look at it before you finalize anything." "I assumed you would." She looked at the pasture. The grass was gray-brown still. Winter beaten, but underneath it you could feel almost, not quite, but almost the green coming. The land was not finished. It was just waiting for the right conditions to show what it was. "I wrote to Clara," she said. "Told her to come visit in the summer if the roads are good." "Good," he said. "She'll want to meet you properly." She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture, not at her, his hands in his coat pockets and his breath clouding in the cold, and he had the look of a man who was standing in a place he built and is at peace with its difficulty, who doesn't need it to be other than it is. She turned back to the pasture. "I'm going to put kitchen garden beds along the south wall of the house," she said. "In the spring. The soil there is good, and the wall catches the afternoon sun." "All right," he said. "And I want to reorganize the cellar storage. The current system wastes space. Do what you need to do." She thought about what she was going to plant. About the summer, and Clara visiting, and the circuit court in April, and the spring herd assessment, and the supply orders she'd send next week, and the 57 things that needed doing on a ranch that was hers, now not by a bargain, not by a debt, but by the plain weight of everything she'd put into it, the work and the worry and the nights at the dining room table, with the lamp burning and the records spread in front of her. "Colton," she said. When you said you'd choose me," she looked at him. "I want you to know that was the right thing to say. But it wasn't why I stayed." He looked at her. "I stayed because this ranch needs what I do," she said. "And because I want to be somewhere that needs what I do. And because," she stopped, took a breath that misted in the cold. "Because when I came back from the South Draw that night, and you were at the kitchen table, the way you looked at me was the first time in my life a person looked at me like I was exactly who I was supposed to be. Not despite anything, just exactly right." He was quiet. Could feel him holding the weight of it. "You are," he said. "Exactly right." She looked at the pasture. The gate stood solid on its new post, the latch down, everything it was supposed to be. "I know," she said. And that was the truest thing she had said in her life. Not arrogant, not performed. Just the plain, ugly laugh. Just the plain recognition of a woman who had done the work and stood in the results of it, and was no longer willing to discount what she knew about herself to make someone else comfortable. She turned and walked back toward the house. After a moment, she heard Colton fall into step beside her. April came to the Harlow Valley, the way it always came to Montana, reluctantly, in fits and starts. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones, mud and ice taking turns with the roads, until neither wagons nor patience could be relied upon. Kitchen garden beds Rosalie had planned along the south wall of the house were still frozen ground in the first week of the month, and she checked them every morning, the way you check on something you've committed to that hasn't yet proved itself, pressing her boot into the soil to feel how far the thaw had reached. The circuit court convened on the 12th. She had not planned to go. She had prepared the documentation. She had given Colton everything the county attorney needed, And she had understood proceeding as a legal matter that would resolve itself with or without her presence in the room. That was the practical position, and she was a practical woman. Colton came to the dining room on the morning of the 11th and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Come to Harlow tomorrow." She looked up from the supply orders she was revising. "The attorney says your records are the backbone of the case," he said. "Briggs's counsel is going to try to complicate. The accounting suggests the losses were mismanagement, not theft. The attorney thinks it helps to have you there. He could have written to ask me himself," she said. "He did ask me to ask you." A pause. "I'm also asking on my own account." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face that was not quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man making a request that matters more than he wants to show. "All right," she said. "I'll come." She didn't ask why it mattered to him that she be there. She already knew. After 5 months of learning the particular language of Colton Hayes, what he said when he meant something, which was usually a small sentence, and what he did when words failed him, which was to be physically present at the thing that mattered. She understood that asking her was its own statement, one he couldn't have made more clearly if he'd written it out. Courthouse in Harlow was a 2-story building on the main street that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool and the specific mustiness of documents kept in closed rooms. The circuit judge had ridden in from the county seat, a large man with a careful face who gave the impression of having heard most of the things people were capable of doing to each other and having filed them all without drama. The room was fuller than Rosalie had expected. She had underestimated how much interest the county had in the proceedings, which in retrospect she should not have. Harlan Briggs had been a known figure in Harlow for 5 years. The Hayes Ranch was the largest operation in the territory, and the story of how the evidence had been found had apparently circulated with considerable detail. She felt the room's attention settle on her when she walked in with Colton, felt it the way she always felt attention, and she kept her back straight and her chin level and found a seat in the 3rd row without looking at anyone directly. Louise Tanner was there, 2 rows behind her. Their eyes met briefly. Louise nodded. Rosalie nodded back. Briggs was brought in by the sheriff's deputy and sat at the defense table looking older than she remembered, and thinner, and wearing an expression she recognized as the specific calculation of a man who has narrowed his options down to one and is trying to decide how to play it. He looked at her once directly when he came in. She met his eyes without expression and held them until he looked away, which he did after a moment, and she filed that away as the last piece of information she'd ever need from Harlan Briggs. The county attorney was a compact man named Garrett, who spoke without theatrics, which Rosalie appreciated. He laid the case out in the order she had organized the documentation, the transfer records, the loss patterns, the Delacroix connection, the Mercer County evidence, and it built the way she had intended it to build, each piece connecting to the next until the picture was complete and required no embellishment. Briggs's counsel was from out of county, brought in for the purpose, and he tried the mismanagement angle as predicted, suggested that the loss records were consistent with poor ranch management in a difficult season, that the pattern Garrett had presented was the product of selective reading of incomplete books. The arrival of a new and inexperienced household manager had introduced errors into the accounting that were being misrepresented as evidence of criminal activity. He was looking at her when he said it. The room was looking at her. She looked back, all of them. She was very good at this by now. Garrett called her as a witness in the afternoon. She had been in difficult rooms before. She had been assessed and found wanting by people who made up their minds before she opened her mouth, and she had learned that the only answer to that was to be so clear and so precise that the assessments, that the facts themselves took up all the available space and left no room for the noise of other people's opinions. She explained the records. She explained the methodology, how she'd cross-referenced the transfer logs against the loss entries, how she'd identified the timing pattern, how the Delacroix entries connected. She explained it the way she would explain a supply discrepancy to Colton at the dining room table, plainly, in sequence, with the numbers supporting each step. She did not use language designed to impress. She did not hedge. When Briggs's counsel asked whether it was possible the losses were simply the result of a bad year compounding on itself, she said it was possible in principle, and explained precisely why the pattern made it statistically implausible in practice, and she did it without raising her voice or losing her thread once. When she stepped down, Garrett looked at her with the expression of a man whose estimation of something has been revised upward. She went back to her seat. Colton beside her was very still in the way he was still. When he was holding something, he wasn't going to put into words in a courthouse. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on 3 counts of cattle theft. Guilty on 1 count of fraudulent record-keeping. The sentencing would be determined at a subsequent proceeding, but the county attorney told Colton afterward, in the hallway, that he expected 2 to 4 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, and that the Delacroix men had already pled to reduced charges in Mercer County in exchange for their testimony. Colton shook Garrett's hand. Garrett looked past him at Rosalie and said, "Mrs. Hayes, your documentation was exceptional." "Thank you," she said. "I mean it specifically. I've had cases where the evidence existed and couldn't be presented coherently. You made this case presentable. That's the work," she said. "Someone had to do it." Garrett smiled a small, genuine thing. "Yes," he said, "someone did." The ride back from Harlow took 2 hours. In the late afternoon light, the sky going amber and rose over the mountains, the valley below them just beginning to show the first thin green of spring in the low places where the melt had reached the grass. Rosalie sat beside Colton on the wagon seat and felt the day settling through her, the relief of it, the completion of something that had been unresolved since November, the particular exhaustion of performing precision under examination for 5 hours. "You were remarkable in there," Colton said. "I was accurate," she said. "That's different." "Not always," he said. "Most people can't hold both at the same time." Accurate and composed. She looked at the mountains. "My father used to tell me that nobody wanted to hear what I was thinking, that I should learn to be quieter, take up less space. Not mean-spirited. He genuinely thought he was helping." Colton said nothing. "The ironic thing," she said, "is that what I was thinking is the reason Briggs is going to Deer Lodge. If I had learned to be quieter, those records would have sat in that filing cabinet until they rotted." "I know," he said. "I don't say that for your benefit," she said. "I say it because I spent a long time wondering if he was right. If I would have been easier to love if I took up less space." She looked at the road. He wasn't right. Colton drove for a moment in silence. Then he said, "No, he wasn't." "So let us." She leaned back as a wagon seat and let herself be tired, which was a thing she was still learning, to allow the simple acknowledgement that a long day had taken something from her and that she was allowed to notice. The wagon rolled on through the evening light, and the mountains were enormous and unchanged, and entirely indifferent to human drama in the way that Montana landscapes always were, and she found that indifference a kind of comfort rather than a diminishment. She had a home. That was the thing she returned to, over and over in the quiet of the return journey. Not an arrangement, not a situation she was managing. A home she had built with her own hands and mind and stubbornness in a place that had not made it easy, and it was hers in a way that nothing in her previous life had been hers. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. Clara arrived in June. She came on the stage from Billings, which connected to the Harlow Road twice weekly, and she arrived dusty and slightly disheveled, and immediately dissolved into the kind of cheerful, exhausting warmth that Rosalie had always found simultaneously loving and overwhelming in her sister. Clara was 20 years old and married and happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who had received from life approximately what she'd expected from it, and she looked at the Hayes ranch, the house, the yard, the outbuildings, the mountains beyond with the wide eyes of someone who had known Rosalie her whole life and was recalibrating. "Rosie," she said, standing in the yard with her bag at her feet. "This is enormous. It's a working ranch," Rosalie said. "It's supposed to be." "But it's yours." "Yes," Rosalie said. "It is." Clara turned and looked at her sister with an expression that had several things in it. Love, certainly, but also something that took Rosalie a moment to identify, because she was not used to seeing it directed at herself, a kind of awe, simple and unself-conscious, the way children are awed by things, before they learn to be careful about showing it. "I told Mama you'd be fine," Clara said. She worried. "Papa too, though he wouldn't say it." "They can come visit," Rosalie said, "when the road is better. Papa won't." Clara picked up her bag. "You know how he is. He'd feel like he owed you something, and he can't stand that feeling." Rosalie did know. She had thought about her father, off and on, through the winter, not with anger, which had surprised her, but with something more complicated, the mixed account of a person who loves someone who has failed them, who understands the failure without excusing it, who has decided that understanding is enough because the alternative is carrying something heavy for no purpose. He doesn't owe me anything, she said. Tell him that when you go back. He'll think you're being generous. Tell him it's the truth. The situation worked out. I'm not keeping a ledger. Clara looked at her for a moment. You've changed. I've been busy, Rosalie said, and took her sister's bag and carried it inside. Colton was good with Clara in the way he was good with most things that required patience or performance consistent. He was quiet and consistent and didn't try to be anything other than what he was, which Clara seemed to find both puzzling and ultimately reassuring. By the third day of the visit, Clara had stopped trying to make conversation with him in the social politeness mode she used with strangers and had shifted into the more natural rhythm of speaking directly and expecting a direct answer, and that worked considerably better. Rosalie watched this from the kitchen doorway one evening, Clara asking Colton about the spring calf count, Colton answering with actual numbers, Clara doing the arithmetic in her head the way she'd never been given credit for being able to do, and felt something warm and complicated move through her chest that she didn't try to name. She's sharper than she seems. Colton said later, when Clara had gone to bed and they were in the parlor, in the particular quiet of summer evenings, the windows open to the warm night. She always has been, Rosalie said. People see the prettiness and stop looking. Same problem from the opposite direction, he said. She looked at him. People see he paused, choosing his words. People see what they decide to see first. With Clara, they stop at pretty. With you, they stopped at large, she said, plainly, without heat. And missed everything that mattered, he said. Same failure, different excuse. She considered this. It was the kind of observation she would have made herself, and hearing it from him in the flat, factual tone he used for things that were true and didn't need dressing up landed differently than it would have from someone trying to be kind. He wasn't trying to be kind. He was stating what he saw. The county assessor came by last week, she said, shifting. When you were in the north pasture, I heard. Harris told me. He was asking about the property boundaries on the east quarter. There's a survey question pending from a neighboring claim. Kendall's operation. He's saying the creek line shifted after the spring melt and the eastern boundary marker needs to be revisited. Colton looked at her. And your assessment? The creek didn't shift. It flooded. Fluting and shifting are different things, and the boundary marker is where it was. She had walked it herself in April, the week after the snow finally cleared the east pasture. The original survey was from 1881. I found it in your filing cabinet. Creek position is documented. He was quiet for a moment. You found the 1881 survey. It was behind the livestock records. Miss Field. Of course it was. He almost smiled. You're going to write to the county land office. I already wrote to them, she said, 3 weeks ago. Expect an answer within the month. He looked at her steadily. Rosalie, I should have told you before I wrote, she said. I know that. No, he said. I was going to say this is the thing. The thing you do. What thing? You see what needs doing and you do it. You don't wait for permission or direction. You just, he paused. Handle it, every time, without making a production of it. She felt something in that the specific weight of being seen accurately, which was different from being praised and considerably rarer. The ranch needs it, she said. That's all. The ranch gets it, he said. I get it. It's not nothing. She turned back to her mending, which was the thing her hands did when she needed to let something settle without looking at it directly. Outside the windows, the summer dark was full of cricket sound and the distant low of cattle and the particular clean smell of Montana in June, warm earth and grass, and the cold underneath everything that never fully left, even in summer. She thought about the question Clara had asked her on the second day of her visit, quietly, when they were in the kitchen garden together, looking at what had come up the beans, squash, the herbs that had pushed through in the weeks since she'd put them in. Clara had looked at the garden and then looked at her sister and said, Are you happy, Rosie? I need to know you're actually happy. Not the performative question she usually asked. The real one. Rosalie had looked at the garden, at the things she had planted in cold ground with her own hands, that had come up because the conditions were right and the work had been done, and she had said, yes, the real kind. Clara had started to cry quietly, which was very Clara. And Rosalie had given her a moment and then handed her the trowel and said there were still 3 rows to weed, and Clara had laughed and cried at the same time and gotten back to work. That was happiness, Rosalie thought. Not the story version, the kind that arrived all at once in a wave. The kind that lived in the particular texture of your days, the work and the difficulty and the moments at the kitchen table and the cold and the things you built with your own hands and the person beside you who had chosen. You on purpose who saw you clearly and kept looking. The summer moved through its long, bright days, and the ranch ran at full operation, for the first time since. Before the previous year's trouble, the spring herd assessment had come in strong. The cattle losses from Briggs's theft were recoverable over 2 seasons, and Harris had proved himself a foreman, who managed men without the need to be the largest force in the room, which was the thing Rosalie had identified from the beginning as what the ranch actually needed. Denny was given the permanent position of lead hand for the South Pasture operation in July, which covered the section he and Rosalie had ridden through in the blizzard. He took the responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understood that it had been earned in a specific way, on a specific night, and he managed the younger hands with a quality of attention she recognized as the particular kind that comes from having once needed guidance yourself. The Harlow town dynamics shifted in the small, incremental ways that social things shift when the underlying facts change. Louise Tanner had come back twice since the apology visit, the second time with a genuine question about her husband's ranch supply management, and the third time with no stated reason at all, just a social call, which was its own kind of statement. Rosalie gave her an hour each time and said what was useful and didn't perform warmth she didn't feel. But something genuine was developing in the space between them. Cautiously, the way plants grow in poor soil, slower than you'd like, more honest than a forced bloom. County Attorney Garrett wrote in August to say that the sentencing had been completed. Briggs had received 3 years at Deer Lodge, the minimum on the cattle theft counts, reduced in exchange for his testimony against the Delacroix men in Mercer County. The Delacroix men received 18 months each. Garrett noted, in a postscript Rosalie read twice, that the case had been cited in a legal correspondence out of Helena as an example of evidence preparation in rural theft cases, and that her name was attached to it in that context. She showed it to Colton without comment. He read the postscript. Then he looked at her. "Your name's in a legal correspondence out of Helena," he said. "It appears so," she said, "for a cattle theft case on a ranch you'd been at for 6 weeks when you found the evidence." 7 weeks, she said. "I found it in the 7th week." He looked at her for another moment, with that particular look, the one she'd stopped trying to categorize, and had simply started accepting as the look that meant you are entirely yourself, and I find that extraordinary, and handed the letter back. "Frame it," he said. "I'm not going to frame it. Put it in the filing cabinet then. The real one. Not behind the livestock records." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and filed the letter, and didn't frame it, but she put it at the front of the relevant section, where she would see it every time she opened that cabinet, which was its own private acknowledgement. The moment that completed the accounting, not the legal accounting that was done, but the human one came in September at the Harlow Fall Gathering. The gathering happened every year in the first week of September, a combination of market fair and social occasion that served as the county's primary opportunity to see itself assembled in one place. Ranching families came from across the territory, which meant it was the first time since the winter that most of Harsalowny would see Rosalie Hayes in a social context rather than a legal one or a crisis one. She had not planned anything. She was not the planning for social situations kind of person, and she had not started being that person. She put on her good dress, which was better than it had been in October, because she had made a new one in April, with the practical acknowledgement that a woman who was going to be part of a community needed clothes that suited the position, and she went with Colton in the wagon, and was prepared to be exactly who she was, and let the room adjust to it. The adjustment happened faster than she expected. It started at the edge of the fairground, where she and Colton were stopped by a rancher named Aldrich, whose operation was 3 miles north of Hayes Ranch, and who shook Colton's hand and then looked at Rosalie and said, "Mrs. Hayes, heard about the Briggs business. You kept the county from having an ugly precedent take root. My appreciation." He said it directly, man to woman, The way people speak when they have decided that a person has earned a particular kind of respect. He moved on. It happened again at the market tables, where a woman she didn't know introduced herself as the wife of the Mercer County recorder they had come over for the gathering, and said she'd heard about the documentation from her husband and wanted to know how. Rosalie had learned the accounting methods she used. It happened again when Harris brought his wife over and introduced her, and his wife shook Rosalie's hand with the warmth of a woman, welcoming someone into a community she's been part of for years, treating Rosalie's presence as simply and naturally belonging. None of it was extravagant. None of it was the public vindication of stories, the formal moment into the square when the crowd turns and acknowledges the person who was wronged. Real life didn't run on those lines, and she had never expected it to. What it was the accumulation of ordinary recognitions from ordinary people who had updated their understanding of who she was, based on what she had actually done, and who were making that update visible in the small currency of social interaction. It was enough. It was genuinely enough. What was not ordinary, what was the moment she would carry with her for the rest of her life, in the specific way that very few moments are carried, was what Colton said in the afternoon. They were standing with Aldrich and 2 other ranchers and their wives, talking about the spring market prospects. And one of the ranchers, a man named Forsyth, who'd been in the territory 20 years, and whose opinion was apparently a benchmark of sorts, made a comment about the Hayes operation that included, as a natural aside, the assessment that the ranch had turned itself around impressively since the winter. Colton said, "That's Rosalie's work as much as mine. Not elaborating, not performing it, just correcting the record, with the same flat directness he used for everything, the way you correct a wrong number in a ledger, not because anyone is watching, but because the number is wrong, and the right one matters." Forsyth looked at Rosalie with an expression that was revising itself in real time. "So," said, not skeptically, genuinely, "the Briggs problem she found," Colton said. "The household systems. The operation runs the way it does because she built it that way." He looked at Forsyth and then at the others. She felt the moment go through her, not as heat or emotion, but as something more like a structural thing, a load-bearing thing, the way a well-placed beam changes the integrity of what surrounds it. She had not needed him to say it. She had known the fact of it herself. But there was something in hearing it said, plainly, publicly, by the person who had the social standing in this county, to say it and have it land, that was different from knowing it privately. It was the difference between being right and being recognized, and she had been right her whole life, and had not always been recognized, and she was honest enough with herself to know that the recognition mattered too, not instead of the inner knowing, but in addition to it. "I had good material to work with," she said, because she believed it, and because it was accurate, and because Colton had built a ranch worth building something on, and that deserved acknowledgement too. Forsyth looked between them for a moment and then said something about the market prices, and the conversation moved on, as conversations do, and the world did not stop turning, and no one made a ceremony of it. But she caught Louise Tanner's eye across the gathering, and Louise nodded a different nod than the courthouse nod. Something more in it. Something that in another year or 2 might develop into the genuine article. And Rosalie nodded back. October came around again. And with it the first anniversary of the morning she had stood in the kitchen of her parents' house, with a pot in her hands, and water dripping off her wrists, and her father telling her she was going to marry a man she barely knew. She did not mark the date sentimentally. She was not a sentimental woman, and she had made peace with that about herself, the same way she'd made peace with most things by looking at it directly, deciding it was what it was, and working with the facts. What she did do, on the morning of the 15th of October, was walk the south pasture fence line that Harris had rebuilt in the spring. She walked it from the gate that stood solid now, on posts set deep and true all the way around to the east quarter where it met the boundary line she defended against Kendall's survey complaint in County Land Office having confirmed the 1,881 markers in August, the matter closed. She walked the full perimeter of the south pasture. It took 40 minutes. The grass was going gold and rust at the edges in the October cold, the same cold that had been in the air a year ago when she'd ridden here for the first time on the wagon seat beside a man she didn't know, looking at a land that was going to be her home, whether she chose it or not. She had chosen it. That was the whole difference. You could live in a place that had been given to you or assigned to you, or that you had arrived at by necessity, and you could manage it and tend it and do good work in it, and none of that was false. But the moment you looked at it and chose it on purpose, with your eyes open, knowing the difficulty and the cold and the specific flavors of its hardship, that was the moment it became something more than a situation. That was the moment it became yours. She stood at the far corner of the south pasture, where you could see the whole valley laid out below the ranch buildings, the creek line, the mountains to the north, still carrying last year's snow on the highest peaks, the road that wound down from Harlow in the east, and she looked at it for a long time. There was no clean lesson in her story. She had known people who wanted clean lessons from lives like hers, who wanted her to tell them that love fixed things, or that goodness was always eventually rewarded, or that if you worked hard enough, the world would come to see your worth. She had been in that kitchen in October with her father's voice, making a transaction out of her future, and she had not been rescued from it by anyone's goodness. She had simply done the work that was in front of her. She had seen clearly and acted on what she saw and refused to diminish herself to make others comfortable, and it had led her here, to this fence line, on a cold October morning, with the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That was not a lesson about reward. It was about what you carry. You carry yourself through the difficult rooms and the cold nights and the people who look at you and decide what you are before you've had a chance to show them. You carry your particular way of seeing the world, your specific stubbornness, the things you know how to do that nobody else knows you know. You carry them not because someone is eventually going to recognize their value. They may or they may not, and you cannot build your life on that possibility, but because they are yours. And putting them down doesn't make you smaller, it makes you less. She was not always right. She was not always easy to be around. She had made mistakes this year, pushed too fast in some moments, held back too long in others, been so focused on the work that she missed the person standing next to her until he said her name twice. She had feared the wrong things sometimes and to fear the right ones. She was going to keep doing all of that because she was human and this was life, and neither of those things produced perfection. But she had not put herself down. That was the one thing. Through all of it, she had not made herself smaller to fit what someone else needed her to be. She turned and walked back along the fence line toward the house. Colton was in the yard when she came back, talking with Denny about the fall pasture rotation, and he looked up when she came through the south gate and tracked her progress across the yard. With the attention he'd been giving her for months now, quiet, consistent attention of a man who has decided that watching someone is a reasonable way to spend his time. She came up beside him, and Denny touched his hat and went back to work, and she stood in the October cold next to her husband and looked at the yard, the outbuildings, the barn, the corrals where Harris was working a young horse on a long line, kitchen garden along the south wall of the house where the beds were cleared now, put to rest for the winter, waiting for spring. "Walk go all right," Colton said. "Fence is good," she said. "Denny's kept it. He has." He looked at her. "You walked the whole perimeter." He was quiet for a moment. Any particular reason? She considered how to say it, the real answer, not the abbreviated one. She thought about a year ago, and about October, and about the woman who had stood in her parents' kitchen, understanding that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't control, who had nevertheless packed one trunk and gotten into a wagon, and arrived here with her back straight, and her chin level, and her mind already working on the problem. "Checking on things," she said. He looked at her with the expression that meant he understood more than she'd said, which was the expression she trusted most on his face, the one that didn't ask her to explain what she'd left out. "The spring herd projections," she said. "I want to talk through the numbers tonight. Harris's estimate seems conservative to me." "Probably is," Colton said. "He's careful. Careful is good. But you leave money on the table if you plan for the floor every year." "Tell me at supper," he said. "I will," she said. She went inside. The house smelled of whatever Alma was doing. With the afternoon's work, something with onion and dried herbs, and the stove in the kitchen was going, and the rooms were warm against the October cold, and the dining room table had the fall accounts spread across it, where she'd been working before her walk. She sat down. She picked up her pen. There was the spring planning to get through, and the fall accounts to close, and the letter she owed to Clara, and the separate note she'd been drafting to her mother carefully. in the way you communicate with someone you love and have complicated feelings about, finding the words that are honest without being cruel. There was the East Quarter boundary documentation to file properly, now that it was resolved. There was Denny's first full season as lead hand to assess and record. There was the list of things she'd identified on her walk that needed attention before the first hard freeze. There was all of it. She put pen to paper and began the way she had always begun, with the first thing, and then the next thing, and then the thing after that, and the ranch moved around her. In its ordinary, purposeful way, doing what ranches do, working, enduring, growing something out of difficult ground through the patient application of effort and attention, and the refusal to stop. The woman everyone had once looked at and decided to discount was the woman who ran the largest operation in Harlow County. Not because she had changed herself, not because she had softened her edges or learned to take up less space or performed a version of herself that was easier for others to accept. 'Cause she hadn't. That was the whole truth of it, and it was enough, and it was hers. And she kept it the way she kept all the things that mattered, not framed on the wall, not announced, but close and real and ready when she needed it. She turned the page and kept writing.